Hello, my name is Nick Carroll, and this is my second Q&A. In this video, I'll focus on the questions that I received after my AMD Kaveri PC build that I performed about 3 months ago. Here we go. So the first user question, how many watts is that Kaveri APU? 300 watt PSU to run all the components is pretty impressive thanks to AMD and their solid APUs. Okay, so the APU itself, which is a CPU and GPU combined, has a TDP of 95 watts, and the rest of the components on the motherboard, the hard drives that I installed, the CD-ROM drive, all told, those probably never exceed more than 50 watts under full load, i.e. when they're all in use. So between the APU and the various drives and the motherboard, that's probably about half of the uses that CPU 300 watt power supply would use. Considering it's a decent processor with a built-in graphics processing unit, which is good for any sort of like a desktop usage, or any sort of web games, or maybe some of your older games at modest settings, I think that's acceptable. The next user writes, you bought an SFX form factor power supply. It's for many ITX builds. This sounds like a question, but it also sounds like a statement. So the power supply that I picked up, it's basically a 300 watt SFX power supply. SFX essentially is the acronym used for small form factor power supplies, and indeed it is a smaller power supply form factor, but it does actually have a bracket to mount in a standard PC case. The problem that I encountered with my build is I was using a mid tower and I was using an ATX motherboard. However, the location for the power supply to be mounted is a bottom mount location, and combined, and basically the small size of the power supply combined with the only 12-inch length of the cables meant that the cables would only go so far in reaching the power connector on the motherboard. Even if I had used a micro ATX or a mini ITX motherboard, the power supply connector would have been in roughly the same spot, so this cable wouldn't have reached. So that was my particular issue in this case. However, I was able to trade that power supply with my son's power supply on his computer. He also has a mid tower and an ATX motherboard. However, he has a top mount location for his power supply. So he was able to, or I was able to easily plug in the power supply there, and there was more than enough. The distance between the power supply and the motherboard connector was like barely 6 inches, so we could easily reach. And in my case, using the standard ATX form factor power supply, I was able to put it in the bottom mount location of the tower, and it worked just fine. So anyways, I just want to say that, and even in his system, he has an older Richland APU, which is another AMD APU, and he has a kind of a mid-range, low to mid-range AMD video card at the moment, and so his entire computer probably never exceeds 200 watts of power. So that power supply has been working really well for him, and the power supply that I received from him has worked really well for me. So all in all, despite that slight hiccup that I had in that build process that night, I was able to recover just fine. So the next question is, I am too also planning to use an A10 7850K for my build, but one of my concerns is if I should get an aftermarket cooler for it. I've heard people saying that AMD stock fans aren't that good. How decent is the cooling, and how loud is it for the stock fan? So the stock AMD and Intel fans that you get are more than enough for any of the CPUs that they come with, provided that you don't do any sort of overclocking. They also come with thermal paste, actually on the heatsink itself. So as long as you don't overclock, you're going to be fine here. On my specific build, I didn't choose to overclock my PC, and I've been running the stock power supply just fine, as well as the stock cooler and everything else. I added a Radeon 270X video card. It's the 4 gig model, and the computer behind it is under a door in my desk. So basically I have a desk down here and a door that covers it up, so I never really hear the PC unless it's under load, and it's more like a little white noise than anything else. The next question is, I'd like to see a picture of Windows Task Manager with Performance tab selected and Resource Monitor with CPU tab selected, and finally all the numbers listed in the Windows experience for this APU build. So I'm using Windows 8 here, and so the output of the Task Manager and the Resource Monitor is going to be a little bit different than if you're using Windows 7. In Windows 8, you're going to see essentially 4 little windows, one for each core. This is a quad core APU or CPU, and so you'd see it that way. You can also select the CPU view and you'll see kind of an average percentage listed here. Now I'm not going to really show that because that's context sensitive. If you're doing absolutely nothing, you're not going to get any results. If you're running different applications, you're going to get different results. I don't really see the value of that. However, I will show the results of the Windows Performance Index on screen, and you'll kind of see what the scores are. Keep in mind that because I'm using Windows 8, there's not like a simple graphical interface you can just click on and get these results. At this time, you pretty much have to type in a command at the command line, and then you have to go to PowerShell and run another command to essentially get the results of the output. And so that's essentially what I'm listing here. So the thing you have to keep in mind is that Windows 7 limits you to a score of 7.9 for any of those aspects as like the top score. And Windows 8 doesn't have that limitation, but I can only assume it uses the same metrics without the artificial limitation of, well, you can't exceed 7.9. So that's why you'll see the disk score essentially get an 8.1, because in this case I'm using Samsung 840 Pro SSD, so I have a pretty darn high score there. The graphics, I'm just not really sure how accurate this is, because the APU is pretty decent. Also the processor memory scores are there, so I hope that helps. So that's basically it, guys. The system's been running fine in the last 2 or 3 months that I've had it. Basically about a month, 5 to 6 weeks after I bought and assembled it, I picked up a Radeon R9 270X video card, the 4 gig edition, and it's been running wonderfully. You know, I'm using Windows 8 as opposed to Windows 7, and I can't really complain. It's been running like a champ. Hope that answers everyone's questions. I want to thank everyone for watching, and have a great day.